Well, welcome everyone. I'd like you to give a nice warm welcome to Zaid Khan. He's an SFI alumni, and I had the immense pleasure of working with Zaid when he was in the SFI program. We had some wonderful conversations together. Um, Zaid is one of the very best reflective systems thinkers that I know, and he has a real meaningful talent for communication in his profession. By profession, he's a marketer. Um, and I think you will come to see that Zad's sensibilities are a really refined set of sensibilities. And he's been working very carefully with David Ng over the last 5 years in the Systems Changes project. Thanks, David, for dropping the link into LinkedIn. So please let's give Zad a very warm welcome for this evening.
Thank you. It's super nice to be here. I just want to say thank you, Stephen and David, for having me. And it's such a pleasure to be able to lecture at SFI because I was in your seat. Well, maybe not virtually, but in a similar position not that very long ago. So it's super almost 360 to come back. As Stephen mentioned, my name is Zaid Khan. I'm a graduate of the SFI program. I graduated in 2020, so that this was September 2020, just after COVID had kind of hit, but it was towards the end. I wasn't that affected. I started in 2016, and I took a little bit of part-time. So you all are part-time as well. So I have even more familiarity with what you may be going through. And I had the chance to work with two different cohorts because I slowed things down a little bit. And in my background profession, I come through strategy by way of advertising and creative communication. So a lot of the strategic thinking that I was doing in my day job, I would go to OCAD at SFI and I would be like, oh, that's what I do during my day. Like I reverse learned the language. It was kind of a funny thing that was happening. And I think systems was the big bug that that I caught and that has still stuck around. And really, it's something that had a profound impact on me because I felt that it gave language to something that I was always experiencing. And so, having a background of looking at the world through multiple lenses, trying to appreciate different perspectives was something I was always in tune with, even as a young child, partly because like my parents are, they immigrated here in the 70s. So you kind of grow up with a different dichotomy of how to understand the world. And it wasn't until I came across systems, I was like, oh, this is a description of what that feels like. So that, anyways, fast forward a little bit to where I am now in my journey. I had the chance to kind of bring some of those learnings, and through the SFI program, I connected with David Ng, who was a guest lecturer. And since then, we've been working on advancing actually systems thinking. So I went from being someone who was learning, I mean, you're always learning, you'll never stop learning, to actually working on and authoring some work in this field. So I'm gonna share screen and kind of just walk through what we've been doing in this project called Systems Changes Learning. And there's a bit of a theme here that I might hit on, and I might even hit on it too much. You can say, okay, Zad, I get the point. You don't need to drive it home, but it's thinking with time. And so a brief introduction to systems changes learning. So this variable of time is going to come up. And this is, when I say a brief introduction, you may have just done the readings, as I understand. The readings are much more deeper than what this is. This is like a shallow, just dip your foot into the pool type of thing. It's not a deep dive, but it may give us enough to have some conversation and give some insights. When I was thinking about this, I was like, this is a chance for me to, and I'm not trying to be self-centering, but also empathize with where you are, is what would I tell my past self when learning systems? So I'm going to come back to this later on. In the film when like someone does the time travel plot and it's like, no, you can't go back and change the plot, otherwise it's going to happen. I'm going to try to change the plot. I'm still going to try. I'm not going to listen to what the writing room says. So I'm going to impart some learnings, and in a way that I hope doesn't impact your natural trajectory. So we'll see whether or not Marty McFly and all of that still sticks. So I know that you all have a systems overload, right? Okay, I see Breck nodding his head. So don't worry about understanding everything. And yes, I come from the era of the blue screen of death on the PCs back in the day. So just take whatever you find is helpful from this. Don't worry about it, and I'll try to give a couple of hints as to what is the single key takeaway. But it's not a deep dive. And I know you're into right now understanding systems, and you're doing some of the workbooks from the Design Council as well as Peter Jones stuff. So this is meant to be complementary, not disruptive. And so that single-minded takeaway, if there's nothing else that you take away from this entire presentation discussion, the only thing that you have to remember is when it comes to this topic of systems thinking or this angle of it, think about time first and space second. That's it. That's all is the takeaway. Think about time first and space second and what that does to your way of understanding systems. Okay, so there's 4 kind of sections I'll go through. One is a little bit about background and context for the work that we have. The second is about theory, but more particularly just concepts. Theory, I'll leave to the papers, and David Ng can speak more in the deep dive, but maybe just sharing the concepts. Methods in a case study, so a little bit of a teaser about the methods that we've started in a case study that I believe was also part of the readings or watchings. And then finally, some implications and a takeaway for you all to use in your upcoming work. Okay, so for the background and context, in 2017, I completed the systems course. There's a little bit of background about where I am. And then in 2018, I initiated some deeper discussions with David Ng. I remember David's like, I go to the jazz festival, it's June, just come meet me there. And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Just like link up at a jazz festival and talk about systems. That feels right. And I was going to the ISSS conference that summer, so I think I was getting some info ahead of time from him. And this was me like being like a spy. I was just like, let me go to the most deepest systems conference and see what I can learn. And I had no idea what they were talking about. I still don't, but I was just kind of like osmosis, like just gathering stuff from them. In 2019, somehow I agreed to joining a 10-year project to rethink systems thinking. And that's what David Ng tricked me on, which is systems changes learning. So I've been tricked ever since then. And then fast forward, 2025, we're in year 7 of 10. So we're able to start to explain a lot of concepts better. A lot of these were just incubated ideas that were really difficult to kind of share early on, but we've done some work on metaphors and examples and then Stephen Davies mentioned my background in communications. So this is where I come in to try to start to explain some of the concepts in a way that's helpful. So we noticed the rising interest in systems change, and you see this in a lot of major organizations. I mean, it's not surprising. This is not an exhaustive list, but you see it from the OECD in 2017 to the McConnell Foundation, more locally in Canada, to Stanford Social Innovation Review, a well-known publication, and even the UN. They're all kind of wrapping their heads around systems change, or they're all developing, tapping into it. Which is not uncommon as an extension of systems thinking as a practice. Then systems change is kind of like a field building method of what they can do. And if you just Google search systems change or even systems thinking, like you'll see hundreds of models, right? There's so many models that come up, and there's been an explosion of models and toolkits and methods, and you all are working through some of those right now. But I think what we notice is that in so much of the systems thinking and the models at hand, there was an orientation towards this aspect of like freezing time and taking snapshots of systems and then plotting the ways of making change. And so we observed that, and we thought, David thought, and we were thinking along the lines of like, how would you approach systems if there's no pause button? What would you do? What would you do if you had to, fix the train while it's moving, or repair your bike while you're biking, or whatever those metaphors are, So it's a kind of an inverted way of thinking about systems change. And this is what the fundamental premise locks us into. So I'll go into that a little bit about what are those concepts when we think that way about being unable to pause the systems or stop the systems that we're working with. And the premise is, so there's one premise and 3 concepts. I won't go too deep, just 4 things total, but So the premise is time, and that's about seeing reality as dynamic versus static. And so when you do that, you emphasize time over space. Again, system change learning, we're emphasizing time. And so the idea is about seeing the world as made up of processes that are all moving through time. And I don't know if David has told you that little story. I mean, I won't tell the full story, but when you look at something like a mountain, you might think that that's a major fixed structure, but in reality, on the larger scale of time, those are moving processes. So what we emphasize here is that most fixed structures, such as mountains, or we see most fixed structures, such as mountains, as slow moving processes. So basically, it's about looking at everything in the world as Stephen Davies just put in there in Buckminster's language as a verb. And I'll come back to that, but literally everything. And it really warps your head, by the way, when you first start doing it, but I'm getting a little bit more comfortable. And so we downplay the perception of reality as snapshots in time. So seeing change as freeze, let me change a couple of things. Okay, let me unfreeze it and send it back out into the world. So we downplay that. And I'm using polite language here on downplaying. I don't want to say this is preferred to that. I'm just sharing what a different perspective kind of brings you. So, and some of this inspiration is drawn from Tim Ingold, an anthropologist, quite an interesting fellow. The temporality of the landscape. Even Stuart Brand's How Buildings Learn, seeing like even the building as a process, and basically just a branch of process philosophy or process ontology. So that's the premise, is that we look at the world through the lens of seeing everything as a process, and so we're emphasizing time. So the first concept that comes out of that way of seeing the world is about rhythms. And it's about understanding the natural rhythms of a living system. And so the idea is to see that all living systems have a natural inherent rhythm. There is some cadence to how they animate in the world. So it's kind of like, going along, basically a wavelength in a way. And so we're now seeing everything as that kind of process or that rhythm. And so we downplay understanding systems as a set of parts in a spatial configuration. Blasphemy, I know, but hold with it for now. But so it really is, you're centering time, so you're seeing it as a process versus space, where you're seeing it as a set of configurations. And this is really drawn from, once again, Tim Ingold, Life of Lines, and also some classical Chinese medicine, which if you did the reading is there. I'm personally not going to go deep into that. I'm still trying to get my head around it, but the inspiration is drawn from that concept. So there is kind of a maximum and a minimum to the time of day that you feel the most energized versus the lowest, to everything, to the sun's peak, to the seasons, etc. So there's a natural rhythm to all living systems. The second examples. So I was thinking about examples, and I'm not like super political, but because it's it's so dominant in the narrative today, or for those who are maybe international, actually you may also be hearing about Canada, but think of the elections as having its own natural system, right? Like every 4 years, or I think it's a little different, but typically every 4 years you have this point in time where it can either continue or it's going to change. And so there's a natural cycle to the vibe, the lifeline of a political party or a certain government that has formed. And I'm going to continue this example through the different concepts because, again, it's so relevant and there's something happening with the timing of it all. So you can think of Elections Canada when they're literally like the office workers of Elections Canada, like they're at maximum activity right now. And then, X amount of time from now, maybe in the summer and the fall, they're going to be at their quietest. The second concept is contexture. So this is understanding when the rhythms weave together in what is formed as like a contexture, like they've all kind of come together. And so contexture is what your system of interest is weaved into when multiple systems intersect over time, or multiple processes, if we were to swap the language. One example that David found that was really profound is this idea of the Vietnamese fish market. So when you think in time, we're thinking about, one might say, where is the fish market? Well, it's not necessarily where, it's like when. When are all the boats going to come together? And so each of these, there might be someone, a fisherman is selling a certain product, another person's purchasing, so they're their own system and they're weaving together. And there's the weather that day, and there's the timing, and there's the state of the river. So this all kind of weave together. And so it's this idea about like, when is the fish market, not where. And I think that's just really interesting when we think about a contexture that way. So we emphasize the larger fabric that your thread is like entangled with or influenced by. So if you're selling fish, you're going to be tangled with all of these others that are coming to the river at the same time. So what does that mean in typical systems? Typical systems, we kind of downplay the neat boundary that delineates inside versus outside. So yes, in some paradigms of systems where we are drawing boundaries, and it's useful, it's helpful, especially in the organization design. But this one, when you start doing it by time, it starts to mix the boundaries quite a bit, which can both be challenging and interesting. And this is drawn from an academic named Kikok Lee. She's based out in the UK. Contextual dyadic thinking is this concept that she has, but also broadly just drawing off of socio-ecological systems. So looking at the environment, looking at its turbulence, i.e. the river, how is it doing that day, and also what's inside and how the boats are coming together. And so this is relevant today because when we think about Canada, I'm sure you all saw this photo as kind of a metaphor or a type of visual story of where we are today. We, as many in Canada, are trying to navigate where are we, and what comes next. And we have to appreciate that our thread of Canada is weaved tightly into our neighbors to the south. And when that is experiencing certain weather, when their tides are, when they're making more waves than usual, then that definitely affects us. So this was a visual someone caught in Burlington. They just happened to be an amateur photographer, and they caught a Canada goose that was being preyed upon by an American eagle. And the snapshot at a time of tariffs and disputes between former neighbors, where this kind of photo took a lot of attention. So yeah, that's the contexture that we're weaved into in time, right? We're at a specific point in time of what's happening south of the border. We are also affected by that turbulence. And the last concept, 3 of 3, is propensity. So this is the inherent potential for change in a particular situation. So there's definitely, like, each of these situations, when all that comes together, there's a tendency of where that can go. So the idea is that a unique situation in that contexture has a tendency towards a certain change. And so David uses this excellent metaphor about, like, when you're going fishing. Maybe there's 2 metaphors, elections and fishing. I'm not sure what's going on with me, but there's something there. It's also about knowing what is, how can you extract the most out of where you go fishing, like the time of season. Are the fish gathering together? Is it the mating time? The bait that you're going to use? All of these things. So the fish have a propensity to nibble on and try to taste what the bait is, and eventually one is going to get caught. But if you go out there and say, I want to go fishing, and it's January, I mean, you might go ice fishing, but your likelihood of how you're going to tap into the possibility of getting a fish is a different, maybe not less or more, but it's different. And so we downplay this predetermination of a desired change and pushing systems towards it, regardless of the time. So a lot of systems change might espouse this idea about, here is the vision that we want to see, and this is the change that we want to work towards. But we ask ourselves, is it the right time, first of all, for that change? And second of all, where is the best place to enact that? And so when you think about the elections thing happening, look at the propensity of this situation from multiple different kind of vantage points. And it's just a really, and I wasn't trying hard to pull this comparison, this analogy through, it kind of just revealed itself, but there's a lot going on here in terms of potential of how the situation can unfold depending on where you sit, or what outcomes that you hope to desire. In January, we had Donald Trump sworn in. And then in February, you had Doug Ford, for those, in Ontario, Doug Ford, February 28th. And then you have a new prime minister as well, just last Friday, March 13th. And so you really look at this from that perspective of like, wow, look at the lineup of the timing that has come together, and what does this mean for all the different interests? What's really fascinating about propensity, and this is where it gets kind of fun. I'm going to entertain a sort of a morbid thought, but like just humor me for a second. If I was asked to be advising the fellow on the far right, so Mark Carney and the liberals, you can get kind of nefarious with this way of thinking. You could say, if you want to continue, if there's a propensity for Canadians to rally against a figure like Trump, then here's a fun thought. Create a secret arm's length group that goes and continues to promote or provoke or push Trump because you're benefiting from his noise. And so it's this kind of like interplay of like, you're not trying to align on perhaps the ideals, you're trying to say where did the interest lie. Anyways, that's just my like kind of off kilter way of looking at propensity, but it does bring out perhaps some of the aspects of nonlinear thinking and causation that's a little bit different than in the mechanical way that we think about. So those were the very key, like elementary concepts of what happens when you center systems thinking as thinking about through time. What happens then is that you can start to see systems as having a natural rhythm. And those rhythms, when multiple systems kind of come together, kind of form this contexture that you're affected by and entangled with. And that contexture having a propensity, a natural inclination towards an outcome. So drawing off of, I forgot to mention, just going back up a slide here, drawing off of Francois Julien, the propensity of things, he channels a lot of Sun Tzu as well. So it's the positioning in the space, the positioning in the field, when is the sun at its highest peak such that you may fire an arrow so that the soldiers are blinded or they can't see. There's all these different mechanisms. There's a propensity. Or Francois Julien uses another example. I like this one, is about like the water when it's dammed has nowhere to go but to burst forward once you like release that. So if you struggle pushing, if the village is struggling removing a boulder, then dam the water, build it up, and then release it, and it will even push the boulder. So that kind of like hits the nail on the head for me about propensity. The water's only going to go gushing forward once that dam is breached. And so that brings up the question of where will things go here? I'm not sure we have the answers, but it's interesting to think about. So those are some of the concepts. For the back half of this, I'll keep going actually. Yeah, I mean, there might be questions, but we can definitely come back to this. A little bit about what do you do with all of that? So with all that ways of thinking and ways of relooking at systems, what can we do with that? So a little bit of methods in the case study. This is where the pace layering really comes in, like shout out to Stuart Brand, about understanding what I'm saying is like the stack, your change stack and the speed of the changes that you're working with. And so Stuart Brand has a wonderful metaphor of looking at the home plan and the site, and there's different layers to what can change. You may say, I want to change things around, and that can mean changing the furniture or changing the stuff inside of your home. But if you want to change more, like, are you really going to change the plumbing? Are you going to really change like the infrastructure itself of the home? So it starts to think about the way that homes or dwelling takes on a life, and how those different layers of change are occurring, and what your interests are, what you have the capacity to change and not change as well. So it's a fascinating kind of look. And then he extrapolates that further, or he extends that even further. Perhaps some of you have seen this, perhaps not, but this is the pace layering, where he kind of just demonstrates, and I'm not saying that this is the be all end all example, it's just an example of a stack where, fashion moves really quickly at the top. So it can go backwards, forwards, up, down, left, right, etc. In commerce and infrastructure governance, and at the slowest pace of change is nature, Arguably at the time of writing, maybe we would decide to move culture elsewhere, I don't know. But it's this idea that you have these changes all occurring at the same time. And so the concept is, what is the natural pace of that change, and what can you afford to change, and what can't you? So that's the starting point that we use to enter people into the method of thinking. So a question comes up is, what can you speed up and what can you slow down? Which is different than just mapping the system and designing interventions. So this is the method is called, or previously called the hub and four spokes, but we're starting with like pacing changes, a little bit of a rebranding. I kind of like where we're going with it. There's not necessarily a hard sequence, but it does go through these different stages. So I'll walk through some of them. But the core concept of how we use this model is about getting change makers to ask better questions about the nature of change that they're working with. So things about, and these are the questions. So I think that's where the learning comes into system changes learning, is you're working with someone who's actively involved in the matter at hand. And there's a mechanism by which the center one, knowing from within, is constantly learning. And so that's the key thing, is about, whereas in some aspects of work, you might try to find better answers. We're always trying to find better questions. And that's the difference between, what we try to do in system changes learning versus some of the other aspects. So reordering pacing, I mentioned this just a minute ago, but it's like, what are the commitments for doing more or doing something faster? What needs to change, So if you want to learn jujitsu in the evening, what do you need to change in your day to free up that time? What are the commitments that you need to do? And what are the commitments for doing less or slower? And so this is really the helpful, probably the most helpful starting point, is if it's just that, if it's just the question about what do you need to speed up and what do you need to slow down, so much gets unlocked from that at a national scale, individual scale, at the scale of your household. You can imagine all sorts of answers coming from that and dialogue coming from that helps you think in time. So not having done the deep dive on some of the concepts with someone who might just be having a coffee conversation, this is where we would start with. We start with like, what is the change that you're working on, and what do you feel like is going slow, or what do you feel like is going too fast? And then we can start to work with it. I've shown you the other direction, so starting from the theories, but that's not necessarily always the case. And then we can move to like recognizing those contextual influences. So what are the external changes that disrupt your systems? What external shifts are tightly or loosely coupled to your system? And what external trends do you expect to continue? When we talk about the second point, the tightly or loosely coupled, I believe that has come up, and even in the examples of what I use in the news today about the American-Canadian relationship, and how much folks are realizing, especially if you go to the store today, you might see these new stickers on the products that say manufactured, made in Canada, etc. It's all in response to just how coupled we are with our neighbors. On the right side, we have diagnosing rhythmic disorders. So this is another entry point, to be honest. You could ask, like, are you feeling off? Why are you feeling off? Like, what is it? What's out of sync? What's not lining up for you? Can you explain why your rhythm is off? Do you expect off being to last a long time? Oh, it's just a seasonal flu. Like, I get this every October. It's all good. No problem. Or is it like it's going to fix itself? So yeah, I'll get better. I don't need, take too much. Or is something really off? Like, no, like my knee is not feeling well. Something's not clicking. I've been playing squash and it's feeling different. I got to go get that checked out. I don't think this is going to fix itself. So just using the biology as another thing that David Ng has influenced me to think about more as systems as biology, again, moving through time. And so this is another way to enter into the types of questions that we want to ask. If folks are struggling with speeding up or slowing down, you can just ask them what's feeling off. And then this one at the south is, when is it a good time or bad time to make the change? Where in the landscape does this change work best, and who likes this change and who doesn't like it? And so you may have a certain, to use the examples, the political examples I've been using, there's a lot of openings now for certain change to occur at a federal level. If you're active in that space, if you're an advocacy organization, you see a lot of them, actually, the civil society putting out publications or putting out notices about what they hope to expect from political parties, platforms, etc. But doing this at another season, doing this in let's say the election is in June, doing this in October may not make sense, right? So it's the sense of timing. It's like, when is it a good time to make that change? Or if you have to make a change in your diet, but you're going to be traveling for 2 weeks, maybe that's going to be a challenge, right? So you might have to tell your doctor, this is a great idea. Can I do this when I come back, etc. So the last one, just to be thorough, knowing from within, this is like that essential question that I believe David has asked you all about: what's the system of interest that you can reasonably influence? And so this is about, like, my favorite way of knowing this, David shared, is like, you can't know, like, if you have experience raising a child, like, they know when they have to go to the washroom. They know from within, and you're training them to tell you, but you can't know uh, how your child might feel. You can predict. You can be like, we're going to get in the car. It's going to be a long drive. You probably want to go. It's like, okay, but only they can know. And so this really is about being on the inside and having that intimate knowledge of how you're affected. So there's a degree of even like skin in the game, to use like a Talib example. And the second bullet point, again, I won't go deep into it for this session, but what yin and yang processes are affecting your rhythm. And I was just chatting with David earlier about trying to grasp that, but I think, yeah, we can talk about that in the Q&A about where yin and yang kind of fit into all of this. So this is the method of asking questions to better understand how people can see the change that they're working on as a rhythm moving through time. That's basically the summary of this hub and four spokes. So there's a case study that the team did in March 2022 with the Canadian Digital Service through Code for Canada. And this is where, credit to David, he was doing a lot of the formulation of these questions. At the time, they might not be as refined or framed in the way that I just shared them, but you can see the groups working through them. And I think on the right side here, it's interesting about under siloed approach, I'll use my laser pointer. It's like too much focus on getting things done, not enough doing things well. And then it's just interesting how they wrote it. If we spend too much time doing things well, we won't get things done in a timely manner. If we do things too quickly, then the quality suffers, so the public doesn't get a good experience. So it's just interesting that they're arriving at their yin and yang, their rhythmic processes of like, how much time are we spending on perfecting the product that we need to launch for our citizens or for our stakeholders, and do we need to speed it up, or do we need to slow it down, and what does that mean? So you can watch the video, and I'm certain there's a recording out there about how this went, and you can just start to get a sense of the types of questions. Again, this was a little bit earlier, before the questions were framed differently, but you can see how it gets us thinking about looking at our systems, especially in an organization design setting. You'll see this come up right away. You'll always see a difference, not always, but often you'll see where organizations struggle is having everyone at the same rhythm, or having everyone acknowledging the different rhythms. So product development or marketing or sales and things like that. So you often see that. Okay, so I'm at towards the end, implications and takeaway. And so I want to come back to that thing about what would I tell my past self when learning systems? And I'm gonna go out on a limb here. Again, I'm breaking the Hollywood narrative, because I'm gonna try to influence the past and see what changes by sharing some info. I'm gonna share a couple of mindset shifts that occurred to me from system changes learning that have shaped my stance as a strategist and as a designer. So there's a little bit of a jump in the narrative here. Yes, I've shared some concepts and some of the methods. I'm going to jump towards what is the implications. They don't map back exactly to the work, but they do bring, this body of work brings up a larger conversation about what is the role of designers and strategists. And that's what I'm going to be gesturing at. So one is that a shift in my thinking about finding an answer to getting towards, and I make up my own grammar, the it dependsness of a situation. So you have to really get to the it dependsness of it. And really that means thinking in context first. So I now I now find myself more resistant to an answer. I'm like, I'm not sure that is that an answer dependent on a certain configuration. I'm more interested in what were the conditions or situation that gave rise to that answer. And that completely messes with your head, not gonna lie. Like you're just like totally just swimming in the context of things, and there's infinite context, which starts to become a struggle. This one's a big one, from being idealistic to being pragmatic. And this is really challenging to sit with, especially in times where a lot of our shared values and ideals are perhaps under like jeopardy or are being kind of like moved. And so being pragmatic really brings about a different way of looking at the world, about alignment of interests versus an alignment of ideals. And I start to find myself thinking that we happen to be born in a time when the alignment was just there, but that may not have always been the case. And perhaps it is a time to start looking at things more pragmatically through the alignment of interests versus values. And there's a lot to say about that in kind of a post-World War II era, and whether or not that's coming to a close and what that means for navigating the future. This one's a fun one. Remember that era of the tech hype and the tech bros? Like, does it scale, bro? How do we make it scale? And now it's like, for me, it's like, can we make it more local? And this doesn't mean closing things off or making more limited, but how can you really make things more local? Like, can you really localize this? And even in my own imaginary internet world, like, what if we had the Canadian version of the internet? You log on, it's like the Canadian internet and the Canadian YouTube and or the Ontario or the Toronto internet. And so like you start to see the world as what it could be as more localized formats where you know the messiness of massive intersections is not beneficial. Mark Zuckerberg was like, the goal is to connect the world. And now I'm like, oh, I'm not sure if that's the best idea. Looking back now, hindsight. Thinking about Chronos as in the clock time versus Kairos, which is the felt time. So this is like a Greek term for this idea that, you know, even in some certain architecture, an architect might want people to spend more time at the pond. So the section that goes over the pond is a windy road, it's a windy path. And so you're trying to play with the felt time or a spiral stairs. I know for me, when I'm working on strategy now, I mean, don't tell, you know, if we interact in the future, don't tell my future clients this, but I'll bake in time just to be like, I know I need to sit with it. I just need to sit with it. There's nothing you can tell me or do or push me that's going to speed up my output. I just need to sit with it. And that might happen on a Saturday in the afternoon randomly, or it might take me 3 months. Well, I probably won't do that to the clients, but it'll take me some time. And so trying to figure out what is your Kairos and how do you feel time plays a big role. This one is lawful order, like law, policy, rules, and shifting towards negotiated order, which is like coordination, flexibility, spontaneity. This, you know, is inspired by David Hawk, who also works with David Ng. And I think you start to see this on like, you know, a funny way I think about this one is like for those in Toronto, when you look at like the, you know, biking versus driving versus whatever, like your ability to negotiate order on the bike is much higher because you can like see people, you can like navigate them, you can head nod to the person who's crossing the street, like, yeah, go for it, whatever. But when you're in the vehicle, you're really, I mean, let's all be honest, how many bikers actually stop at the stop sign or have to come to a full stop? You know, you might kind of slow down to a crawl. But in the vehicle, if it's 3 a.m. and it's a red light, you're most likely going to stop. And so, and in another case, like when we think about change and change making, so much of the end outcome is a policy shift and a policy victory or a legal victory. I'm no longer certain that that's the way to go. I'm no longer certain if that's actually helpful. I think there's value in having an ability for negotiated order to play a larger role on how we figure out our interactions in society. And that's a shift for me because I definitely was in the advocacy space. Like, how do you make policy change, theory of change, all that stuff? This is the second last one. So this one was about designing the solution or thinking of yourself as a designer of the solution. You're actually designing the multi-paradigm inquiry into the issue. I guess it kind of ties to the first one, an absolute answer versus the it dependence, but you're not trying to get to the answer, or you can't reasonably get to the answer in a wicked problem, in a complex issue, or in a mess. But what we can do really well is try to design that inquiry that looks at it from multiple perspectives, and try to bring people who have those multiple perspectives, and even ones that may or may not be, you know, certain favor, you know, we may not favor all of those personally, but the ability to bring those together is the design craft, I believe, and is what the design craft has shifted towards. And this is a big one. This is a big one to think about. From the quality of inquiry depends on how many of those multiple perspectives you can really bring that enrich it. So I've been thinking about that a lot. I even have a political theory I might share sometime. And the last one is the designer's bias towards actions, towards letting things run their course without intervening. And I call this one humbling design. And so this is really about looking at the world, especially when you look at it through a time lens, and say, I could do something, and someone might even say you should do something, but is it better just to leave it alone? Will this issue or this phenomenon correct itself? Will it find a landing that may be more favorable if I didn't affect it? Maybe I should take some of my own medicine and not try to nudge you all towards this way. But but like, you know, is there a non-intervention that is actually a deliberate posture that you want to take? That's probably I left that one last because that's my biggest one. That's like that's the one that I'm working through the most. Even in my MRP, I kind of come to that realization that like there's a role of like just humble design, just put it where it really belongs. Like it's not, we may be overstating how transformative it can be, such that it tricks us to always taking action, but we're understating how much it can help us be patient. And perhaps there's a balancing act to be done there. So those are kind of the mindset shifts that this work has led me towards, from being where I was graduating from SFI and going through the system changes learning and talking with David Ng and the team on hours on end about looking at the world through the lens of time and really appreciating it really is like a non-Western orientation of how change works. So those are mine as takeaways, and I'm speaking to myself in the past. I'm trying to say this is what I took away, Zaid. Let's see if this is helpful or not. Again, take what you find helpful. So now it comes down, speaking of pragmatic, okay, what's the one thing? Steven's clapping or he's killing a fly? One of the two. I'm joking.
Killing a fly.
Okay, so speaking of being pragmatic, what's the one thing you can do to apply system change learning concepts? There's one thing, just one thing. And it's not even a long list. It's not even deeply philosophical. It really just is this. Oh, I didn't click it. Use verbs. Just use verbs. Just use verbs. So like in your understanding systems, when you say this process erodes this, just say eroding. And then it'll already start the ball rolling on how to think about it over time. And yes, there's the David Ng. And there's something poetic about David Ng being the author of this work, and he just adds ing to everything. So he's David Ng. Ha 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 ha. So just add ing. That's all you got to do. So that's the main takeaway. Like keep doing the deep dive on all the other systems, philosophers, and bodies of work and thinking. Take what's valuable from this, but if there's one thing you want to do when you're thinking through time, is just try to see if you can use verbs and make things more animated and in motion where and when you can in the work that you have. Okay, so that was the single-minded takeaway: is time first, space second, and I'll be seeing you in time. That's all.
Thank you, Zaid.
You're very welcome.
It was a beautiful presentation. It was like a balm for the soul.
And if there's anything you want me to pull up back, I can do that as well as we're chatting, but definitely open to Q&As and any thoughts or reflections as well.
Aileen.
This is perhaps more of a tactical question, but why 10 years?
I think so. The way we discussed it was, can you commit to meeting once every 3 weeks? And the answer was, yeah, that's a degree of commitment we can make, like meeting for, I think it was 2 hours or something, once every 3 weeks. Like, yeah, okay. So based on how much depth we think we want to get done, let's put that to a 10-year timeline. That's how it came out. It's very much a juxtaposition to how common timelines are in other parts of our lives and world. And I thought that was actually an attractive point. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool.
Sarah.
I have a couple questions, and apologies if I'm not fully understanding all the concepts, but how much is there any overlap at all with some of the concepts, like for like systems and time, and then like futures, as I kind of understand futures today? Like, is there at all a relationship there?
This is a very good question. I'm also thinking about that and figuring it out. The futures practice, from what I know, or from what I know so far, it does see things in time, but it's a little bit, I'm trying to think about how to describe what orientation it takes. It's slightly deterministic in certain ways when you have the different Kona futures or the different scenarios or the different scenario plannings, and it maybe doesn't grasp with the moving variables as well as this body of work does. So it kind of humbles foresight to be much more bounded in the time frame that you can reasonably interact with and anticipate, and then it becomes a constant anticipation versus a longer stretch of foresight. Now, that's not to say there's no value in doing the foresight work, and I think where David is at, and David, you can chime in if I'm not describing it correctly, is trying to better calibrate. Like, there's a field of, I'm going to describe another thing. There's a field of work called anticipatory systems. I'm not sure if it's on the curriculum. And we're trying to reconcile that with some of this pacing changes as well. So how well can you anticipate based on your existing model and your understanding, like the metabolism that's moving through? But I think that's my honestly, Sarah, that's just my intuition. I have to look into it more and draw out where is the overlap and where is it working better and where is it complementing or where is it different. But I'm gonna, yeah, David, maybe you want to complement that answer on foresight.
So there's a subtlety which I lectured in week 2, which was Russell Ackoff saying that you have to design a system for right now. So we had reactive, which is we want the system as it was. We have preactive, we want the system as it is in the future. But this is philosophical about whether the future exists or doesn't exist. And the interesting thing about having done this research now and ending up in Chinese philosophy is that the Chinese language doesn't have verb tenses. And so when they say things, it's like, this happened yesterday or this happened tomorrow. We don't have this, it's happening, and so that's just an observation. When you have a whole language and culture that doesn't have verb tenses, it's like, well, no wonder they think differently.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the idea about designing futures, having spent as much time as with Russ Ackoff stuff, I understand what he was getting at, because idealism is generally at some point in the future, and the question is, could you be ideal for right now?
And that right now, David, is constantly moving into the future. So it's like right now, right now, right now, right now, right now, versus foresight is like, okay, 50 years from now. And that's maybe perhaps a description of the two different orientations. I think, Stephen, you were on mute, but you might have called the next person.
I did. My apologies. I did call for Ni.
Yes, so I think I have the questions related to the pacing changes. They happen for spokes model, and I have a couple questions related to that. I know you laid out those part of it. I wonder which how do you distinguish between a temporal disruptions and a systematic pacing shift? Like, what is a differentiate between what just like a temporary disruptions and what will be a pacing shift? And another one is that what would it take to make these book talk to each other? Like any type of interdependencies or any ways for these processes and spokes to actually talk with each other? You're muted too.
I can answer, thank you for that. I can answer the second one first, and maybe the first one I might get a little help with from David. But the second one is that perhaps I didn't model it accurately, but these are constantly, each of these questions are constantly flowing back to knowing from within, and then they can flow back out again. So they are connected to from basically learning. You can just consider this the center learning. So there is connection points that way. As for the first question, which was about how do you know the temporality of a rhythmic disorder, correct? How do you know how long it would be?
Like basically, like how do you know the permanence of change? Is it happening just like temporary, or is that like will be a big shift?
That's a great question. I think I'll take a stab at it, David. Let's see. Which is one is that it may be something that recurs. It may have its own cycle, but it's not maybe like as frequent. So it might come certain amounts of times, and so you may know that it's going to go away. And I think something is really more permanent or gathers your attention when it actually really fundamentally breaks or sets something off. And so I think that is how we can start to understand. And again, this is the word knowing from within. Those that are affected by that offness will know if something is off, versus someone else who's external. Yeah, David.
So one of the fine points here is that you're getting at is actually about multiple stable states. And this is actually something that if we had actually taken the panarchy model, this is the part where I tell people that they think they understand it, but they won't understand it so many years later. And so trying to ground this, because a lot of the thinking of this came from classical Chinese philosophy and Chinese medicine, as you stop and think about this, if your body could have multiple stable states. And so the question is, how do you know when someone is actually they're going on a diet? How do you know when they've actually reached that different stable state? And it's like, well, you don't really know until they're that state. But it's possible for you to lose weight and then you're eating less and you're exercising more and still be in balance. So all of that ties in with all these different spokes. And the idea, if you get right down to the labeling of this, is that the center, the knowing from within, is a system as a whole, and each one of the each one of the spokes connects into that. If you actually start at 12 o'clock and move your way around, this is actually like a medical diagnosis where you would start off with the doctor's going to ask you, well, why are you coming to see me? Because something must have changed. So, or is it the weather, or is it you had an injury or an accident or something happened? Because you wouldn't go to the doctor without it. Diagnosing, they're trying to actually figure out what is going on. The prognosing part is actually in the medical journals, they say they don't have enough of, which is if we give you a treatment, which treatment should we give you and will you stick to it? So I turned vegan to reduce cholesterol, and it works within 3 weeks. The problem is that only 30% of the people can retain being vegan after 1 year. So in doing prognosing, it's kind of like, well, I've managed to maintain veganism, but other people can't. And then the repacing, the reordering of the pacing starts getting into those commitments. And so when we talk about the going vegan, my wife is not vegan. I used to be the cook in the family. So she has to pick up all that slack. So all these things come together. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yep, I think it's I was able to can see how things are connected. Maybe just like maybe a connection to it is that you know what, I will let us think a little bit, and I will ask you when it come up. Yeah, thank you.
Nice, thank you, Nee. I really appreciated the distinction that you drew out, Zaid, between chronos and clock time versus kairos and felt time. I think, speaking from the first person, I can tell you that, like, the parenting and the socializing that I received as a child systematically disconnected me from my felt time, from kairos, my felt time. And it wasn't until much later in my adult life that I actually discovered. I took a sabbatical in the mid 90s for 18 months. It wasn't until I was, almost 30 years old that I actually, for the first time in my life, attuned to what I would call my natural rhythm. And, I would say that there's actually, because society is so sped up, and the rate of change is so sped up, I would say that we're actually have a crisis in people actually being connected to their own natural rhythms and actually having a direct sense of their own felt time. And so when I go to your hub and spoke model, which now has the new name, if you could flip over to that, that whole central bubble of knowing from within, then, what is, how can we achieve that level of knowing when we're broken in a primary way around rhythm? Is really the reflection that's coming to me, because I think about when I think about the group work in the SFI program, it's really a horrible forced march where teams, new relational systems are created when 4 people are put into a team, and they really have no time for the team members to attune to one another's, felt sense of rhythm. And yet they're forced to achieve these, these deadlines for their project work. I just feel like we've got a compounding. We're not doing any favors in the SFI program in terms of helping our designers to know from within when we're not allowing them to work at the rate of their own rhythm. So I mean, so this notion, your whole takeaway is time first, space second. And I just want to let you know, like, when I really let that in, it reorients everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
what do we do about that?
I think your reflection made me think about, and David, you have a slide on this, about the movement from when we would work according to the daytime, right? Like we in agrarian cultures, even pre-modernity, you wake up at the dawn of day, and then you'd actually have a siesta at the peak sun as well, and then go back out, and then long winters meant you're kind of recovering. And then the Industrial Revolution happened in the 20th century. We're actually moving into the factories, and now you have a light bulb, and this light bulb makes you able to, okay, you can put these mechanics together. We put these car parts together for X amount of hours. And now we have the coordination capacity to do so much more asynchronously. There's almost no clock time, so to speak, is everyone's subjective clock time, not necessarily Kairos time. So it really is a confusing time that we're in, pun maybe intended. But one thing I was thinking about, Stephen, as you're making that reflection of like, we're kind of set up to force ourselves in this Chronos time against being able to learn. The one reframe I can suggest is to, perhaps for the students, is to use this as an opportunity to understand what it feels like when you're not on your Kairos. So you could learn like how you want to adjust later. So take this as the learning ground to say, when I'm forced to march at this beat, here's the best I can do, or here's what we can do, or as it is the way it is. This is what the OCAD institution forces us to meet this deadline, all of us together, including Stephen. So let me learn from what that feels like. And then let me take away what I can do differently when that constraint is not there. Perhaps that is a reframe that brings the learning into it.
Thank you. That's exactly the point we made before your guest lecture with respect to some of the artifacts and choosing tools to try and model in a situation and then finding the tool is not useful, and then this fear of having wasted time.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? It's not wasted time. You now know one tool. What was it? Was it Benjamin Franklin that said, I know 100 ways to not invent the light bulb?
Yeah.
Lauren.
Yeah, I just think it's really interesting because we talked about time in our innovation research methods course this week, or last week, I guess, too. And we're, learning about co-creation and how, gosh, it sure takes a lot of time the more consulting people that you do. But like, yep, it's kind of like you're front loading that time consumption for a very good reason, and you're not, in opening up the process, it's not time wasted, it's time very, very well spent.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Thank you, Lauren.
Megan.
Yeah, just a quick. Oh, sorry, Alba's before me. Her hand is up first.
Sorry, Alba. Go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. No, Meg, you can go. My question is not as that relevant.
Okay, quick question. So when you talk about temporality, I'm wondering if there's any analogy to draw between like aliveness and death, right? And like, another way to look at time is through these phases of life. So I'm just curious if that comes up for you at all. I think it sits with the medical metaphor as well, right? And there's like we've talked a little bit about hospicing in our other course. So yeah, over to you.
Yeah, I think the biology metaphor really fits. David, do you want to take that point about death? Because they're like, that's a perfect, you have that. Remember you said that?
Equilibrium is death.
That's the line. So David jokes that like, if you want to find the perfect state, the perfect equilibrium, that is death. And so that's how much of an inversion this perspective is on time, is that there's always going to be an instability that you will be working with. And that's just the nature of reality in this case, but a perfect equilibrium would be death. But I think the other part of your question, especially with hospice care, you start to see that metaphor being used in a lot of design services about how do you help something gradually, find its footing or find its closure. I think there's a lot there in terms of the analogy, and I think thinking it through in a biological way will help with that question: what do you need to speed up and slow down? Because that might help with the hospice stage, right? Like, what are the commitments that need to change if you want to help someone kind of ease into a different stage of life as you move ahead? So I definitely see that, and there's a lot of body of work. There. And I think the transition design, I don't want to throw too much at the curriculum, Stephen Davies, but the transition design community out of Carnegie Mellon University. So they're doing interesting work, not necessarily on this question that Megan asked, but they are looking at the transition, the design of the transition, and then you can kind of use that to imagine that. So that's another, there's another category of folks to look into.
Alba, did you still have a hand? There she is.
Yeah. I was just it's just well, I think a pretty quick question. So if this is 7 out of 10 years, where do we follow for the next 3?
Who's gonna take that, David, me, or like, I don't know.
So the theoretical work and the philosophical work is done and published. We are now working on methods and practices. And so you are welcome to join the System Changes Learning Circle when you're finished your degree. Because you don't have time.
And it's a 10-year commitment.
Yeah.
No. At year 10 we stop. Like we're serious. Like we are actually down now to methods and trying to find better ways of explaining this, because Zaid has done the presentation. He shouldn't cite me so much, but these are like things that I've done, but I'm waiting for Zaid to create his own metaphors because that's his job.
But the question stands out, but like, where does this go? And I think, as David said, like, we want to produce maybe a more, as much as I was like kind of throwing some shade at toolkits, I think there's value there of like creating a methods architecture. And these questions are just the beginning ingredients of it. So the next 3 years are about what are the methods that others can use. So it's basically about reproduction, the reproducibility of this method. So that's what David and I are working on, and we're working on that in tandem with case studies. So we want to find folks who may be interested. And again, this is another incentive. If anyone is interested in applying these to a certain setting, then we would be interested in getting those learnings for a case study so that we can attach it to methods as well. So that's an open call for anyone as well.
Thank you, Zaid. Breck.
I'm just curious, how often does it come up and how does it affect the conversation in terms of Indigenous knowledge and their understanding of time being cyclical rather than linear? Because I feel like a lot of the systems work goes on about our existing and manufactured times and having to adhere to that. Whereas Indigenous knowledge tends to be like that, like, they tend to go with the flow of what's just what already exists and what's natural rather than like impose their ideas of that over top. Just curious how often it comes up and what does that conversation turn into?
Yeah, it does come up about different understandings of the nature of time, and even like the topic of history, like how do you look backwards? And some people look backwards as a line, but others look backwards as more like circular, and including Indigenous knowledge, but there's also like other civilizations that look at time differently. So that topic comes up, Breck, and I think you're right to indicate that that may be another frontier of this work, perhaps after the 10-year mark, to say like, what does it look like when you connect it to sociology, understandings of time? And so in this case, our perspective would say, well, you can appreciate the longer arc or the longer cycles of time. So these do complement one another in terms of like, there's a lot of work being done in, what's that guy's name? Peter Turkin. Cliodynamics is the name of his field. It's a funky word, but he's kind of pioneering that field about seeing time as cyclical, basically, and looking at different civilizations and how they've gone through similar periods. And there's other folks as well. Neil Strauss does the fourth turning. I think that's Neil Strauss, or the fifth turning. I can't remember. So it's coming up, and it's funny that it comes up more often. And then as you mentioned, people are also looking at Indigenous ways of knowing and how their conception of time can be helpful. I think it speaks to where, not ironically, but where we are in time. I think we're at a time when people are reimagining where is our civilization and its thread. And I feel like people are bringing up these questions more often than not because we might be going through a shift. And so we're looking at these examples. So that's how it comes up. But David, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and so when Stephen introduced the Indigenous reading into this course, I did the reading too. And the interesting part that I've learned from having looked into Chinese philosophy is that in the philosophy of yin yang, this is one of 6 schools that happened in the Warring States period that ended in 220 BCE. And so I'm having to now parse and say, this is yin yang school. This is not Taoist school. It is not Confucius school. So the caution that I have when we talk about indigenous, and so I just started looking into this because it was for this class. It's like the Hopi. It's the Hopi that actually have the idea. And so it's not uniform across all of them. And so I'm chafing a little bit at now thinking about indigenous knowledge. Our friend Susu has been claiming that she's Finnish, and she's saying that what is indigenous knowledge in Finland because she's indigenous. Like Finland goes way back, and so she has that. And so the indigeneity, I think we need to look into more carefully, and not just give a broad brush across it.
Good, great answer. Thanks. I just wanted to bring one other thing up, which is hilarious and very timely given the time change we just went through. I forget who it was. There's like an Indigenous saying. It might not even be attributed to anybody because that's also an Indigenous way. But the whole notion of in referring to daylight savings time, I think Indigenous peoples tend to say only the white man would cut the cut the top off a blanket and sew it to the bottom and say that it's longer.
That's funny. Yeah. I mean, that goes to show like where we, in some ways, it goes to show where we are in our conception of time, that we can take our scissors, cut it, as you said, or as they say, cut and add it, and the hubris that we have to be like, oh, we've changed time. I don't know about that. Yeah.
Leslie?
I just have a question about, so thinking about just what you were saying about sort of moving towards the methods piece of this work. And Zaid, as you were talking, I was hearing this real sort of elegance and kind of simplicity in the language. Maybe simplicity is not the right word, but in a lot of the tools we've used, they have this very business lens or technical lens. And one of the things that we've talked a lot about as a group is kind of putting the very technical aspects of systems next to these philosophical concepts, and they sometimes don't feel like they're fitting very nicely together. And I get the sense that that's something that you've wrestled with quite a bit. So I'd love to hear just some more on your thoughts on that, and how do we sort of translate this forward if some of those more technical aspects of the systems language aren't jiving?
Oh, that's a big question in a good way, because I've actually struggled with that for a long time. Like I've always been, and I've gone through different phases about like, why is it written this way? And how do we make it more simple? And then I'm like, oh, that's a little too simple and you're losing the nuance and this is not helpful and they're misleading. And then I've oscillated myself. I think the answer is lies somewhere in the metaphors that we try to use. Whether you want to say metaphors or storytelling or analogies, I think there's value in just giving people an illustration of what the concept is. My personal belief is that the language is just a layer to our understanding of like what we may feel and understand deep inside. And so I'm less, David knows this, I'm less accurate, to be honest. I'm less accurate for the sake of conveying the message. And David is much more accurate for the sake of scholarliness. And I think both are needed in different contexts. And I try not to mix those negatively, but where needed. And so in engagements or consultations with folks who may not have a deep understanding of systems thinking, we just try to use that everyday language about approaching them about what feels off and what's not working and what do you need to change, and et cetera. And when we need to get published, we may dial that up even past the dial might break if it goes up to 11. And so, but that is an endless question, Leslie. I don't think that question's been asked all the time. Like, how do we, last thing I'll say is my joke, or what I say to some people, is like, I think I've landed on turning it up to 7 out of 10. I don't dial it all the way down, but I'm not going to go to like 10. I'm in a 7. You know, I'll use a couple of the terms, but I'll cloud it or wrap it into something that's familiar.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I feel like that 7 keeps it from becoming like jargony, and you know, then it becomes just like a practice that's rooted in a particular like like jargon, versus being something that's more intentional or coming from a place of maybe empathy, or that kind of idea of interception. So thank you.
And it helps that my background training is in this craft as well. So I have to do this day in and day out for other things that I'm maybe less interested in. So when I do it here, I'm really trying to work with it.
Yeah. I can't tell you the number of cybernetics conferences I've been to where all of the leading intellectuals are sitting around the room lamenting the fact that cybernetics has not been adopted. And when somebody points out it's because the language is largely impenetrable, and that it's they write for their own audience as a bunch of specialists, they all just sort of nod sagely and yeah, that's a problem, and then they admire the problem. So I really appreciate where you've landed on that, Zaid. I think it's vitally important. We were just talking about cybernetics and language last week, and so. And also, I appreciate the pragmatism as well. I think the pragmatism is vitally important. So, thank you for that.
You're very welcome. Yes, lovely to be here. I appreciate it.
I think you know, I go back again to what you've offered in terms of time, time first, space second, and you know, I just am aware. I turned 62 in January, and I've really struggled over the last, I'm going to say, decade, probably longer, 12 years, since I turned 50, with the, like, I feel like I know nothing about time. I really do. I don't understand time. I'll just be really honest. I don't understand time. And so it's a mystery to me. And so I really, the invitation to think of time first is really, I'm hearing that as a call to inquire into mystery. That's how it's occurring to me. I wonder how it's occurring to others. How does that occur to others? How does, when Zaid says your one takeaway is time first, space second, how does that occur to you? What might it mean to you? Brag. I feel like it's a framework for control of the masses. Okay. Jen.
For me,
Yeah.
I feel like there's this intentionality that needs to be placed around boundary setting, because so often we're pushed to move faster than we're comfortable, whether it's, you know, fast food, fast fashion, like deadlines, like across all the spheres of our life, we're out of control with the time. We're like being busy is a currency. And so really intentionally placing boundaries around the time and taking the time that you need. And it's interesting because you had said that, Zaid, that you had taken more time with the program than you wanted, or not that you wanted. That was my own, it's not what I meant. What I meant to say is that it's perceived that that's not what you would want. Whereas that's not necessarily a true thing, right? So it's, if you take an extra semester, it's perceived as a bad thing. If you take extra time to do your deadlines, it's perceived as a bad thing. But flipping that and being like, no, like this is my boundary and that's a good thing because I need that time.
Yeah, that's a
Wonderful.
good point. I feel better about my past decision now, Jennifer. Thank you. I didn't even, I'm like, oh yeah, I did do that. Okay, cool.
Sarah.
Mine was a little bit like, since you opened it up, Stephen, like I was kind of struggling with the concept of space. Because I think that I can understand time and I can understand space, but I feel like time and space kind of as presented. Because I think as you were describing like the motion, that kind of makes sense to me. But then the only thing that then I can think of space is maybe it's Jen's point of a boundary, but it's like, is it physical space? Is it like, so I'm curious, maybe other people's thoughts on, your interpretation of the word space in this context.
Nice. Thanks, Sarah. Adam?
Yeah, maybe I'll just pause and see if anyone wants to answer Sarah, because I'm back on the time thing.
Oh, okay. Good stuff. Lauren, are you queuing for space or time?
Oh, time.
Okay.
All right, time it is then. Yeah, I was just gonna say this made me think a lot about how time's not all created equal. I remember years ago I read something about how time is not equal throughout your life, and how time is actually slower during sort of your formative years because so much happens, and that time actually moves slower for those people, and then it speeds up again as you get older, and they're just not equal all over time. And I think this is what this conversation is making me think of, is like, is time's not a single thing, right? So if you open yourself up to this sort of concept that it's all relative, and it's all what you make of it, and it's going to be different from, I don't want to say time to time, but it's not a set construct. I think it changes what's possible, right? I'm sure anyone has kids is constantly like remarking how they say these things that blow your mind, and you're like, how the hell do you think of that? And it's just because they haven't been taught not to think of it yet. My son is constantly saying things about like, what if time doesn't exist, or if it goes backwards, or if we've always been here, or if we're never actually here in the first place. Like, I think that openness to thinking of it differently opens a lot of possibilities for you to think of systems and everything else in a different way. So yeah, I really appreciate this conversation.
Thanks, Adam.
The one addition I'll add based on Sarah and Adam's combined points is like, the context that I might build upon, Stephen, of your reflection is like, what do you think about when it comes to understanding change through the aspect of time for a space second? Because we can look at reality as moving as processes, but oftentimes so much of the change that we describe, we like to see, it feels mechanical. It feels like we want to push something in a direction. And so the alternative prompt is to, when does it feel right to make the change? And maybe that's why, Sarah, of contrasting the two space variables.
Thanks, Ad. Lauren, are you good, or you want to come in?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Well, as much as I hate to do it, I think we need to bring this conversation to a close. I just want to say a very big thank you, Zaid, and a very big thank you to David for bringing in systems changes learning. I think this has been a marvelous, I won't call it a reorientation. It feels like you just made the space a lot larger by adding time, or maybe you've made time a lot larger by adding, I don't know. You've done something. Anyway, Aileen says Systems Thinking Ontario meeting second Thursday in April, right? Is that correct,
That is
guys?
correct. That's a Chronos yes.
That's a Chronos yes. All right. All right. Well, thank you, Zaid. Very well done. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really grateful, and I'm so happy with that, with the discussion. And I hope that turning things into a verbs leads to something. So I look forward to kind of seeing the outcome of that.